Lady Chatterley's lover. Yes, the continuation with me, Morel Benard. Last time I said his heart melted suddenly like a drop of fire, and he put out his hand and laid his fingers on her knee. "You shouldn't cry," he said softly. But then she put her hands over her face and felt that really her heart was broken and nothing mattered any more. He laid his hand on her shoulder and softly, gently, it began to travel down the curve of her back, blindly, with a blind stroking motion, to the curve of her crouching loins. And there his hand, softly, softly, stroked the curve of her flank in the blind, instinctive caress. She had found her scrap of handkerchief and was blindly trying to dry her face. "Shall you come to the hut?" he said, in a quiet, neutral voice. And closing his hands softly on her upper arm, he drew her up and led her softly to the hut, not letting go of her till she was inside. Then he cleared aside the chair and table and took a brown soldier's blanket from the tool chest, spreading it slowly. She glanced at his face as she stood motionless. His face was pale and without expression, like that of a man submitting to fate. "You lie there," he said softly, and he shut the door so that it was dark, quite dark. With a queer obedience she lay down on the blanket. Then she felt the soft groping, helplessly desirous hand touching her body, feeling for her face. The hand stroked her face softly, softly, with infinite soothing and assurance. And at last there was the soft touch of a kiss on her cheek. She lay quite still in a sort of sleep, in a sort of dream. Then she quivered as she felt his hand groping softly, yet with queer, thwarted clumsiness among her clothing. Yet the hand knew too how to unclothe her where it wanted. He drew down the thin silk sheath, slowly, carefully, right down and over her feet. Then, with a quiver of exquisite pleasure, he touched the warm, soft body and touched her navel for a moment in a kiss. And he had to come in to her at once to enter the peace on earth of her soft, quiescent body. It was a moment of pure peace for him, the entry into the body of the woman. She lay still, in a kind of sleep, always in a kind of sleep. The activity, the orgasm was his, all his. She could strive for herself no more. Even the tightness of his arms round her, even the intense movement of his body and the springing of his seed in her, was a kind of sleep from which she did not begin to rouse till he had finished and lay softly, panting against her breast. Then she wondered, just dimly wondered why. Why was this necessary? Why had it lifted a grey cloud from her and given her peace? Was it real? Was it real? Her tormented modern woman's brain still had no rest. Was it real? And she knew, if she gave herself to the man, it was real. But if she kept herself for herself, it was nothing. She was old, millions of years old, she felt, and at last she could bear the burden of herself no more. She was to be had for the taking, to be had for the taking. The man lay in a mysterious stillness. What was he feeling? What was he thinking? She did not know. He was a strange man to her. She did not know him. She must only wait, for she did not dare to break his mysterious stillness. He lay there with his arms round her, his body on hers, his wet body touching hers so close, and completely unknown, yet not unpeaceful. His very stillness was peaceful. She knew that. When at last he roused and drew away from her, it was like an abandonment. He drew her dress in the darkness down over her knees and stood a few moments, apparently adjusting his own clothing. Then he quietly opened the door and went out. She saw a very brilliant little moon shining above the afterglow over the oaks. Quickly, she got up and arranged herself. She was tidy. Then she went to the door of the hut. All the lower wood was in shadow, almost darkness. Yet the sky overhead was crystal, but it shed hardly any light. He came through the lower shadow towards her, his face lifted like a pale blotch. "Shall we go then?" he said. "Where?" "I'll go with you to the gate." He arranged things his own way. He locked the door of the hut and came after her. "You aren't sorry, are you?" he asked, as he went at her side. No. Are you?" she said. For that? No, he said. Then after a while he added, "But there's the rest of things." "What rest of things?" she said. "Sir Clifford, other folks, all the complications." "Why complications?" she said, disappointed. "It's always so, for you as well as for me. There's always complications." He walked on steadily in the dark. "And are you sorry?" she said. "In a way," he replied, looking up at the sky. "I thought I'd done with it all. Now I've begun again." "Begun what?" "Life." "Life?" she re-echoed with a queer thrill. "It's life," he said. "There's no keeping clear. And if you do keep clear, you might almost as well die. So if I've got to be broken open again, I have." She did not quite see it that way, but still. "It's just love," she said cheerfully. "Whatever that may be," he replied. They went on through the darkening wood in silence, till they were almost at the gate. "But you don't hate me, do you?" she said wistfully. Nay, he replied, and suddenly he held her fast against his breast again, and the old connecting passion. "Nay, for me it was good. It was good." "Was it for you?" "Yes, for me too," she answered, a little untruthfully, for she had not been conscious of much. He kissed her softly, with the kisses of warmth. "If only there weren't so many other people in the world," he said. She laughed. They were at the gate to the park. He opened it for her. "I won't come any further," he said. "No." And she held out her hand as if to shake hands, but he took it in both his. "Shall I come again?" she asked wistfully. Yes. She left him and went across the park. He stood back and watched her going into the dark against the pallor of the horizon. Almost with bitterness he watched her go. She had connected him up again when he had wanted to be alone. She had cost him that bitter privacy of a man who at last wants only to be alone. He turned into the dark of the wood. All was still. The moon had set, but he was aware of the noises of the night, the engines at Stack's Gate, the traffic on the main road. Slowly, he climbed the denuded knoll, and from the top he could see the country, bright rows of lights at Stack's Gate, smaller lights at Tavistock Pit, the yellow lights of Tavistock, and lights everywhere, here and there on the dark country, with the distant blush of furnaces, faint and rosy, since the night was clear, the rosiness of the outpouring of white-hot metal, sharp, wicked electric lights at Stack's Gate, an undefinable quick of evil in them, and all the unease, the ever-shifting dread of the industrial night in the Midlands. He could hear the winding engines at Stack's Gate turning down the 7 o'clock miners. The picked worked 3 shifts. He went down again into the darkness and seclusion of the wood, but he knew that the seclusion of the wood was illusory. The industrial noises broke the solitude, the sharp lights, though unseen, mocked it. A man could no longer be private and withdrawn. The world allows no hermits, and now he had taken the woman and brought on himself a new cycle of pain and doom, for he knew by experience what it meant. It was not woman's fault, nor even love's fault, nor the fault of sex. The fault lay there, out there, in those evil electric lights and diabolical rattlings of engines. There, in the world of the mechanical, greedy mechanism and mechanized greed, sparkling with lights and gushing hot metal and roaring with traffic, there lay the vast evil thing, ready to destroy whatever did not conform. Soon it would destroy the wood, and the bluebells would spring no more. All vulnerable things must perish under the rolling and running of iron. He thought with infinite tenderness of the woman. Poor, forlorn thing. She was nicer than she knew, and oh, so much too nice for the tough lot she was in contact with. Poor thing. She too had some of the vulnerability of the wild hyacinths. She wasn't all tough rubber goods and platinum like the modern girl. And they would do her in. As sure as life, they would do her in, as they do in all naturally tender life. Tender. Somewhere she was tender. Tender with a tenderness of the growing hyacinths, something that has gone out of the celluloid women of today. But he would protect her with his heart for a little while, before the incestant iron world and the mammon of mechanized greed did them both in, her as well as him. He went home with his gun and his dog to the dark cottage, lit the lamp, started the fire, and ate his supper of bread and cheese, young onions and beer. He was alone, in a silence he loved. His room was clean and tidy, but rather stark, yet the fire was bright, the hearth white, the petroleum lamp hung bright over the table with its white oilcloth. He tried to read a book about India, but tonight he could not read. He sat by the fire in his shirt sleeves, not smoking, but with a mug of beer in reach, and he thought about Connie. To tell the truth, he was sorry for what had happened, perhaps most for her sake. He had a sense of foreboding, no sense of wrong or sin. He was troubled by no conscience in that respect. He knew that conscience was chiefly tear of society or fear of oneself. He was not afraid of himself, but he was quite consciously afraid of society, which he knew by instinct to be a malevolent partly insane beast. The woman, if she could be there with him and Arid there were nobody else in the world, the desire rose again. His penis began to stir like a live bird. At the same time, an oppression, a dread of exposing himself and her to that outside thing that sparked viciously in the electric lights, weighed down his shoulders. She, poor young thing, was just a young female creature to him, but a young female creature whom he had gone into and whom he desired again. Stretching with a curious yawn of desire, for he had been alone apart from a man or woman for 4 years, he rose and took his coat again and his gun, lowered the lamp, and went out into the starry night with the dog. Driven by desire and by dread of the malevolent thing outside, he made his round in the wood slowly, slowly. He loved the darkness. Arid folded himself into it. It fitted the turgidity of his desire, which in spite of all was like a riches, the stirring restlessness of his penis, the stirring fire in his loins. Oh, if only there were other men to be with, to fight that sparkling electric thing outside there, to preserve the tenderness of life, the tenderness of women, and the natural riches of desire. If only there were men to fight side by side with. But the men were all outside there, glorying in the thing, triumphing or being trodden down in the rush of mechanized greed or of greedy mechanism. Constance, for her part, had hurried across the park, home, almost without thinking. As yet, she had no afterthought. She would be in time for dinner. You must listen. She's going to dinner. You must listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover with me, Morel. See you then.